Welcome to the Frontline Club once again. My name is Allan Little. I'm a BBC correspondent, and our guest tonight is Anthony Loyd. Before I introduce Anthony to you, however, I want to make some housekeeping announcements about the Frontline Club. Tomorrow, 7:30, there's an event, an Insight event with Patrick Symes, moderated by Rosalind Bain, called Castro, His Friends and the Revolution Generation. Patrick is the author of The Boys from Dolores, so please do come to that if you're interested in that. On Sunday, there's a screening. It's a film called Child Slavery with Raggy Omar, and it'll be followed by a Q&A with the director Richard Ulwin and the producer Barbara Arvanitidis. Is that right? Sorry. But not Raggy. So those two events this weekend, please try to come if you can. If you're not a member of the Frontline Club and you're interested in joining, please talk to somebody downstairs after the event, where you're welcome to come and join us for a drink. We'll spend the next hour and a half, though, talking to Anthony. Let me tell you, I first met Anthony Loyd in 1993, I think, when you came to Bosnia for the first time. Is that right? 93?
That's right.
I'd already been doing the Yugoslav war for a couple of years. Anthony turned up with no journalistic experience and a camera. He'd just left the army, where he'd been an officer, and within about 6 weeks he was writing the most perceptive, revealing and beautifully written coverage of the war of any of us, and it was very striking that he was going to be an important voice in reporting war, one of the most important voices of his generation. So it was very rewarding to be his comrade and colleague on the road for the insights that he brought. And he had an uncanny ability to get to know people on the ground and to understand the way they thought and to reflect it in his prose. And he's the author of 2 books, one of which you will, I'm sure, know, called My War Gone By, I Miss It So. And this new one, which is called Another Bloody Love Letter. And what he does in both of these books is evoke the spirit of war in a way that is unmatched, I think, by anybody of our generation. And having made him blush, I now want to put some questions to him. I'll speak to Anthony for 20 minutes or so, and then it's open to you, and we'll have a conversation about whatever you want to ask him. Anthony, this is another bloody love letter. It's a love letter to several people and several things, it seems to me, as a reader. It's a love letter to war. It's about a love affair with war. It's about a love affair with your mother. It's about a love affair with Kurt Schork, whom we both knew. And it's about a strange relationship with addiction, with narcotics. I don't know whether you'll accept that characterization, but let me start by asking you, when do you think you first fell in love with the idea of war?
I think I fell in love with the idea before I'd ever been to a war. I was brought up at home in an environment which was, by and large, I was brought up with women, with my mother and my sister, and staying a lot with my grandmother. And the war experiences of the men in my family who were absent, either because they were dead or because my father had left home when I was quite young.
Can you point the microphone at your more directly?
Mouth.
That's better.
Does help, doesn't it? The men were absent, but they'd all been to war. And there were 2 figures who were particularly present, even though they were absent. My mother's father, my grandfather, who was a navigator in Wellington's and latterly Lancaster's in the Second World War, who died when I was very young of leukemia. And my mother's grandfather, who had also died just before I was born, who was a decorated war hero who had lost his arm and his eye in war and was wounded 9 other times apart from that, and won the Victoria Cross and the Somme. Now, war wasn't shoved down my throat when I was a child, but these men were very present. These 2 men were very present at home. They were present in pictures. They were present in stories. And particularly in the absence of a father figure, I started to believe that war was a place where, as a man, you went to war, you proved yourself. It was a sort of path of initiation, a rite. But of course I didn't know about the realities of war. So as an idea, it was a lovely idea, and it was a very attractive idea. So that's where the relationship started, before I'd actually been to a war.
And then you went to 2 wars, in a way, as a serving officer, Northern Ireland and the Gulf War.
Yeah, that's right. I joined the army when I was 18, and during the 5 years of my service, went to Northern Ireland and the Gulf, and neither of which, I mean, Northern Ireland, the British love to call not a war, but an internal security problem. If you were perhaps a Catholic nationalist, you would have said that it was a war. It was a war of sorts. I had an interesting time there, but I certainly didn't see what I would understand as a war going on there. Then I was in the first Gulf War, which was, as a ground war, was very short. It was a 100-hour war. During those sort of 5 days that we moved from Saudi Arabia through southern Iraq and then into Kuwait, I saw almost nothing that matched with any of the expectations I had. We were met, I suppose, fortunately in hindsight, by thousands and thousands of surrendering Iraqis, and action remained a sort of elusive fugitive.
And was that frustrating?
Hugely. It was at the end of my 5th year in the army. I was due to leave the army before the Gulf War had even started. My time was up, and I was appalled that I was about to leave and miss this war. So I extended my service for the duration of the war and went out as a volunteer attached to another unit. Waited in the desert. The war happened. The war ended. I was still in the desert thinking, well, I didn't see it.
What about? How did you get the idea that you could get access to war through journalism?
Well, I'd figured out that the British Army at the time, the era which I was in the British Army was having quite a boring time. I mean, it wasn't since the Falklands in 1982 that there had been a big war until the first Gulf of 1991. And so my logic was, well, if I wait for another war, I'm probably going to wait another 9 or 10 years. And I don't want to do that. I had read books like Dispatches by Michael Herr in my teens, and I'd realised that, well, there's not an ongoing Vietnam, obviously, but these guys, war reporters, seem to have an interesting and varied freewheeling life with a lot of access and a lot of choice in the way they access war. I think I'm going to have more fulfilment as a journalist than I am as a soldier.
Do you think this is, I mean, we're talking about, something that you and I both have in common, this desire to go and report, to witness wars, to be participants in wars, if you like. But it's not normal, is it? It's pretty weird.
I wonder how weird it is. I mean, I think young men the world over, particularly young men, seek some sort of defining experience as they leave childhood and move to manhood. And in many cultures, that is either a war experience or a type of proxy war experience. That said, I look back now and think of all the people I know in this profession, and particularly as I'm older now, 40, and I'm much more aware of the intricacies of the way we work. And I look at what we do, and increasingly I think, well, that is not normal. That is not a normal choice. To go to other people's wars and witness what we witness and go through, to an extent, what we go through, I mean, let alone what the people who are involved in the wars go through. Increasingly I think, well, that is quite strange.
Yeah, because you allude to this several times in the book about feeling like as though you're on safari through the theme park of somebody else's misery. I mean, that is, what comes across is something that I have felt quite strongly at various parts in my experience, is that you sometimes feel meretricious, as though you're almost like a vulture, a creature of carrion, picking over other people's misfortune.
Absolutely. I mean, there are many, many paradoxes as a journalist in war. We profit in a way from wars, and we profit directly. We get paid for covering other people's wars, and we profit perhaps personally in terms of reputation and all the rest of professional reputation. One profits on a daily basis, perhaps if you get a particularly good story to do with other people's suffering. And there is often a sense of betrayal as well in intruding on people's lives at perhaps their most vulnerable point, and intruding upon them when they haven't perhaps got the wits about them that they may have in a normal environment to say, look, actually I don't want to speak to you, or I don't want to give this detail away about what has happened to me. And we intrude upon them in those moments and broadcast or publicise those moments of their vulnerability. And often I feel elements of a betrayal or a vulture-like or parasitic status.
Because the truth is, you enter a world and it becomes your normality, in which, I mean, I heard a colleague of mine say the sentence down the phone to London, great news, there's been a massacre in the Lashkar Valley.
Absolutely. There's one instance I talk about in this book where I was in Afghanistan. It was about 2001. Kabul hadn't yet been recaptured by the Northern Alliance. I'd been very sick. I'd got dysentery out there. And a friend of mine, Seamus, came into this room where I was, dingy little room where I was recovering. And he said, hey, I met an Afghan. He's missing his foot and his hand. When he first said it to me, I wasn't that interested, because you see dozens of Afghans missing their foot and their hand because there's so many mines there. It's very common to walk down a street and see several guys missing their foot. And often an anti-personnel mine will take off, the hand or the arm on the same side as it's taken off the foot or the leg. And then he said, yeah, but there was diagonal opposites he was missing. He was missing his left foot and his right hand, or the other way around. And he had a story to tell, something about it being cut off, but whatever. So I was curious, and I found this guy the next day, this Afghan with his foot and hand missing. And he's a very, very angry, intense young man. And he was missing his hand just above the wrist and his foot on the other side, just above the ankle. And he told me the story. He didn't willingly indulge me his story, but I persevered and sort of squeezed it out of him. He'd been a prisoner of war. He was a Mujahideen with the Northern Alliance. He was captured by the Taliban, put in prison in Kabul. One day his guards came to his cell and said, you're going to be free. He was a bit perplexed, but they took him outside, put him in a jeep, drove him through the city towards the Ghazi Stadium. And it was morning, it was foggy, it was in the winter. And he started saying, hey, what's going on? There was silence. They drove him into the middle of the stadium, thousands of people watching from the stands. He was dragged out, pegged down, given local anesthetic in his leg and his arm. And 7 doctors, surgeons, came into the middle of the stadium and sawed off his foot and his hand. He was fully conscious throughout. And I said to him, so what did you look at, the sky? And he said, no, I was transfixed by the sight of them sawing off my foot. And what had happened was, under the Taliban's interpretation of Sharia law, if you're caught thieving for first offence, or perhaps second offence, I can't remember now, they'll take off your hand. But if it's a subsequent offence, they might take off your hand and foot. A rich Pashtun had been caught on a second or third thieving offence and had paid off the guards in the prison to use a prisoner of war to cut his hand and foot off instead of the guilty party. Anyway, having cut off his hand and foot, they took him to hospital. He was there for a few days. I mean, Afghan hospital, no joy. Then he was put in a taxi. He was driven by the taxi driver to his parents at his family home. His family had no idea that he'd even been taken prisoner of war, let alone what had happened to him. So they get confronted by their son with his hand and foot sawn off. And his mother had a heart attack and died that day. So then he becomes a beggar with the stigma of a thief, even though he wasn't a thief. He finally makes it across the front line to get to the Northern Alliance side. I speak to him. I get his story. I drove back to the room where I was going to write it. I wrote it, sent it back to London. And I remember I washed later that day. And I say that because it was very difficult to wash in Afghanistan at the time. There was very little water. And there was a hammam there. It was a sort of subterranean cavern of stone. And the Afghans had a water tank, and they'd rigged it up over a fire, so you could turn on the tap and hot water would come out. And I remember washing myself. It was a great feeling. I felt very clean. It was first wash for some time. And I remember murmuring, great story to myself. And then just being aware, well, yeah, great story, but and aware of the sense of a personal victory somewhere. And the boss and everyone was saying, "Wow, what a story," and there was I profiting it from this account of this man who probably hadn't really wanted to tell me his story in some way. And that kind of example happens, I have found it to happen quite frequently. And one does feel like a parasite.
Let me ask you, what was it like turning up in Bosnia with no journalist experience? How did you go about it? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people here who think about doing the same thing.
So I left the army. I applied to go to a course run by the London College of Printing in photography and journalism. It was a 9-month course. It was a postgraduate course, and I hadn't been to university, but they had me on the basis that I had been in the army, and it was a sort of alternative experience to university, if you like. It was okay, the course. It wasn't very high-powered. They could have wrapped it up probably in a month, but it took 9 months. It was fine. But at the end of that, so I sent my CV off to various papers saying, look, I've just done this course, and I used to be in the army. The war started in Bosnia. Employ me. And of course everybody, well, hardly anybody even replied, and 1 or 2 people said, no, sorry. So then I realised, well, you're either going to do this, and do this now, or you're never going to do it. Here is a war that started. It's obviously a very important war. It's in Europe. We're a few months in now. Are you going to do this or not? So I thought, right, I'm going to go and I'm going to try and set myself up as a freelance journalist there. And I was intimidated by the prospect, which was going to involve sort of hitchhiking there. But I thought, and also I didn't have that much money. I had about £3,000. I sold my car and, got whatever else for a few £100. But I was like, well, sink whatever you've got into this. And I taught myself the rudiments of Serbo-Croatian in London. And by coincidence, the woman who taught me Serbo-Croatian had friends who were still stuck in Sarajevo. They're actually a Bosnian Serb family, but living in the government area. They were under siege. And she said, look, if you can reach these people with money that we're going to give you and medicine that we're going to give you, you can live with them as long as you like. They'll be any too happy to have you there. To cut a long story short, so some friends gave me a lift part of the way, then I hitchhiked the rest of the way. I had some iffy accreditation, which I'd got someone to sort of fix for me, which suggested I was a journalist. I managed to get a UN flight in. I found these people. And it was a shock arriving in Sarajevo. I arrived in Sarajevo and you ran out of the plane and the mortars were going off at one end of the airport, and there was machine gun fire. This was in 1 minute after getting off that plane. I'd seen and heard more than I'd ever seen in 5 years in the British Army. This was real. Nervy Ukrainian soldiers, a lot of shooting. Get on an APC. There's shooting all around you as you get towards the Holiday Inn. It's cold. It's winter. There's snow on the ground. I jumped out of the Holiday Inn, very disorientated, quite excited, but disorientated. I stayed there for one night while I found a Bosnian who could guide me to where this family's flat was, which was very near the front line. And found this family, which was quite a moving moment, because I brought with me letters from their people in London and money and medicine. And they hadn't heard anything from the outside world for 9 months by that point. I was quite set mentally as to what I was trying to do. But at the same time, I realised it was an easy place to die, Sarajevo, then. Particularly where this family lived. It was probably 100 yards, if that, from the front line. And to leave the flat to get across to the centre of the city where you could buy foodstuffs on the black market, you had to run. And there are a lot of examples of what happened if you didn't run fast enough. And you see brains lying by the edge of the street and all the rest of it. People get shot and die. I felt quite set mentally in my head about what I was trying to do, but I wasn't negligent about it. I was aware as to what could happen there.
Let's talk about another one of the great loves that you speak of in this book, and that's your friendship with Kurt Schork, because it's shortly after that you met Kurt in his office in the Holiday Inn, isn't it?
Yeah, so next, I'm staying with this family, but I'm still no closer to becoming a journalist. And I was quite intimidated by the scene in the Holiday Inn, which wasn't so far away, but it was where most of the media were staying. And I had no credit with which to penetrate the group of journalists there at all. I didn't know anything about journalism beyond what the LCP had taught me, which wasn't much. And, you know, how to break in socially to this group and find out how they worked and maybe travel with someone or ride with someone and see some stuff. It was very difficult, but I met a photographer, one of the members here, Gary Knight, who was, in Gary's way, sort of congenial and warm. And he said, look, speak to a guy called Kurt Schork. You'll find him in the Reuters office up there. If anyone can help you, it'll be him. So I remember going to the sort of door and knocking on it. I was very nervous and awkward and didn't, you know, what did I have to go in there with? Nothing. And there was this terse sort of, come in, from the inside. So I opened the door and there was this figure at the other side of a desk. He was tapping away, had his glasses on, and he looked up. And so I said, you know, sorry, we haven't met before. My name is Anthony, and I want to become a journalist. And yeah, it was a dramatic scene. There was shell fire off in some far distant corner of the city and everything. And he was like, well, what are you doing here? What room number are you in? And I was like, no, I'm staying with this family over there. And he said, well, where over there? And I said, oh, Giulia Danicica. And he's like, well, that's just by the front line. And I was like, yeah. And he said, how did you get here? And I said, I ran. And he laughed, and he said, and he stopped working and said, well, look, hang on, pull up a chair and just explain yourself a bit. And I did so. And he said, look, I don't know when I'm not next going out. I'm writing on a story now, but come back and see me in a couple of days. And, yeah, I'll take you somewhere interesting. As it happened, several weeks would have passed before I next plucked up the courage to go back to the Holiday Inn. Kurt wasn't there when I did go back. And I was next to meet him properly, actually, a few weeks subsequent to that in central Bosnia, which was where the focus of the war was then rolling. There was a different type of war happening there. It was between the Muslims and the Croats. And
which is where I met you.
Which is where you met me, yeah. And I met Kurt there, and Kurt said, yeah, ride with me.
Did anybody else in this room meet Kurt Schork? Put your hand up if you did. One person. Two. Three. Three people. Four. Why was he so extraordinary?
He was, in any of our lives, we are very, very lucky if we meet one or two shining people. And in my life, Kurt was one of those shining people. He was an absolute iconic figure, which was apparent as soon or very shortly after meeting him. He was someone who was physically and morally extremely courageous. He had a very, very sharp mind. He had a bullshit tolerance of absolutely zero. He would tell you right to your face there and then if he thought you were trying to turn him over. Watching him deal with press spokesmen, spin doctors and bullshitters was like watching someone clubbing seal cubs on the Bering Straits. Bad, but good. He had and something which lifted him above the vast majority of the media profession. He had a very profound sense of justice and clarity. He had also come to journalism quite late in his life, in his 40s. He had many other experiences in life, including sort of running the New York transport system. So he was very familiar with dealing with a huge workforce, many problems, and all the rest of it. So he was absolutely not intimidated by talking to generals. I mean, he knew the scores to many of the sort of administrative problems that people running armies had. Plus, he was probably the funniest man I've ever met. He was a very compassionate man. He was also a very angry man. And none of these words actually still do justice to Kurt. Kurt shone. He was a great, great man, and for those who knew him, it was our fortune. He was unlike others.
I was in Sierra Leone with him when he got killed, and talk me through how you heard that he'd been killed. In May 2000, the story had really, really picked up in Sierra Leone. The RUF, the Revolutionary United Front, probably the most heinous one of the most heinous guerrilla movements in Africa, certainly in West Africa, were encroaching towards the capital, Freetown, for either the second or third time in the sort of 8-year war. These guys were completely wigged out. I mean, absolutely wacko. That doctrine was a mixture of sort of Marxist theories mixed with voodoo. They indulged at times in sort of cannibalism and human sacrifice. They were out there. A British force had deployed to Freetown to try and save it from falling into the hands of the RUF again. Hundreds of United Nations soldiers had been taken hostage. I got the call to go from my boss and picked up my visa. Kurt had got the call to go and had gone. The day I was due to fly to join him, a war started between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which was part of an outstanding border dispute. And my boss diverted me to Ethiopia. So I arrived in Addis Ababa. I was very irritated not to be in Sierra Leone, and I hoped the war would be quick between Ethiopia and Eritrea so I could hurry up and meet Kurt in Sierra Leone. Paradoxically, Kurt was unhappy with his experiences in Sierra Leone, and he wanted to come and join me in Ethiopia. And we had this sort of pathetic conversation on the telephone, each urging the other to remain where they were and be joined. Each were arguing over who didn't have the best African war. And I won most arguments with Kurt. He won, but that one I won. There were other factors which led to his decision to stay, but I urged him to stay in Sierra Leone. A night or 2 nights later, I was in my hotel room in Addis, and it was about midnight, and I couldn't sleep for some reason. There was no presentiment or anything like that. I just couldn't sleep. I was watching, it was MTV. I was sick of CNN, watching MTV, and the phone rang, and it was a Reuters journalist who said, "Look, is that Anthony Loyd?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Look, I'm calling you because I know you're a good friend of Kurt Schork's, and there's been an ambush in West Africa. A team's been hit. Quite a lot of soldiers have been killed. 2 journalists have been killed. We don't know who, but 2 dead and 2 wounded. And the nationalities are an American, a Spaniard, a South African, and a Greek. 2 are dead and 2 are wounded. We don't know who's dead and who's wounded, but one of the dead might be Kurt." And in the minutes afterwards, which sounds awful to say because I knew who the potential cast of those 4, I knew all of them. But in the minutes afterwards, I felt quite relaxed because one thing was for sure, Kurt would not be among the dead. Kurt had that sort of weird energy about him that I always believed he would be all right. But I did start ringing people in London then saying, "Look, please find out more for me." And then sat and waited. And then a couple of hours later, a phone call came back from a correspondent, a Times correspondent in Freetown, who just said, "I'm sorry, Anthony Kurt's dead." And what was that like?
I shut off quite quickly. For a second, there was a sort of cataclysmic second, because it did actually challenge my belief structure as well. I absolutely believed, as strongly as I believed everything, that Kurt would not die that way. But it was a very short second. And then I realised, look, you've got to get things done here. And from another friend, I found out that Sabina, his girlfriend, will be flying from America to London to collect the bodies, and I was like, things need to be done. The bodies need to be collected, deal with the family, and sort of worry about it afterwards.
Let's talk about let's talk about the other theme that runs through both of your books, which is the heroin addiction. I mean, the phrase you use in both books is war for work, heroin for holidays. Nicely alliterative. How did you get sucked into a heroin addiction?
That's a very good question. I should, age 40, have more of the answers at hand, but I found that actually the passage to addiction, the same as the passage out of it, is quite opaque, and I would like to sit here and say I had more of the answers and be able to explain better how I got there and how I got out. I can't say it's all a blur, but I wish I had more of the answers in hand. What I found was heroin preceded war. I'm not making any claim that heroin grew out of war. Like I'm sure many people in this room, had experimented quite freely with drugs in my pre-army youth. In my teens, I'd taken heroin already, aged 17 or 18. Then straightened out my life, joined the army. Later, after leaving the army in London, living with a group of quite hedonistic friends, I tried it again on multiple occasions, and seen its thrall, and we thought we were quite sort of beautiful and turned on at the time, and we probably were, but chasing the dragon wasn't a great idea. But then, when I started going to war and went off to Bosnia, when I came back, that's when the hook of the drug really set in. That's when the appeal really started. I don't think it was as much to do with the horrors of war as to do with the difficulties of the sort of flatline experience of peace in London.
My experience was that it was the horrors of peace.
Oh yeah,
the horrors of being back in London.
Yeah, no, peace was much more of an intimidating environment, and the whole energy one came back with from war, the sort of sense of meaning and clarity one had there, and the whole drive, and then suddenly this awful sort of revved emptiness of peace, and that's when heroin became a really attractive option, and remained in that way probably between 1993 and 1997, in that when I was away in war, it was another world, and it took me away from the habit, away from any sort of appetite to take heroin at all. But as soon as I was back, literally arriving in Heathrow, I would get the sort of choke in the back of my throat and be ringing a dealer often before I'd even collected my baggage from the carousel. Then in 1997, of course, well, I say of course, some people can sustain addiction indefinitely, depending on the drug and their lifestyle. But for me, I couldn't sustain it. I couldn't sustain it anymore. It started falling apart. And each time the boss called and said, "Can you go on another assignment?" The come-downs would be terrible. And coming down from smack on the way to war in Chechnya is just not an experience I'd like to repeat.
But the odd thing is, I remember, you and I knew each other quite well during the Bosnian war. We were there for 2 or 3 years together. You functioned extremely well. You became one of the most insightful, most valuable of the press corps, and none of us, at least I didn't, not many of us knew. I certainly didn't know that you were struggling with this sort of other, this alter ego back in London. It was as though you were two completely different people.
Yes, it was an experience of two completely different lives. And I didn't struggle when I was away. I had my job, did my thing. It was just not an issue. I didn't even used to crave for the drug when I was away. But I understood what the word crave meant during that era. And the craving used to start, and it was a craving. It was like a sort of psychological incontinence, in that I knew that things were going badly wrong, and no matter how I tried to shore up my brain against the appeal of the drug before I came back, as soon as the wheels had touched down of the aeroplane, any of those walls that I'd built up in my brain were gone, and I'd want to use, and did so.
Let's go on to talk about something else, because I'm already aware that I'm overrunning my time, and I want to throw it open. Your mother died recently. Why was that such a? Beyond the normal tragedy and grief of losing a parent, for you that was an extraordinary landmark, wasn't it? You wrote about it in the Times at the time. I remember reading it and sending you an email saying how struck I was by your account of it. What did that signify for you?
For me, it signified a number of things. It signified the end of my youth. It felt like the end of my family as well. My father was already dead. He died about 14 years before, or quite a long time before anyway. And I wasn't close to my father. We had quite a relationship of some rancor. And my family was tiny. We were divided by divorce and sort of feuding. It was a very small family, and to some extent it felt like the family was my mother, my sister and I. We'd all had quite independent relationships, but we were very close. I was very lucky, as I had a friend, as I did in Kurt, to have the mother I did in my mother. She was a very liberal-minded, open, interesting woman, and she'd given us a great upbringing. And it was a difficult time, my childhood, in many respects, but we had a lot of fun at home. She was a very broad-minded woman, and I remember she was alone amongst almost everybody when I said that I was going to go to Bosnia and try and do what I was going to try and do then. Most people said, "Look, you're absolutely mad. This is going to end up, in tears." And she, almost alone, was like, "Look, you've got to do this." Now, given the normal cycle of things, people's parents die before, or parents die before children. The death of parents is probably something everyone's going to have to face in this room at some stage. I may have felt a little hard done by to have lost mine at both by the time I was 36 or 37. It was exceptionally tough, I felt, because we were an extremely small family, and she was, I use the word again, but she was an iconic figure for my sister and I. She had a courage which was quite esoteric. She was very graceful. She was a nurse who looked after terminally ill people. She was quite familiar with death. She had a very raucous sense of humour, but was a very gentle and graceful woman. She was a great mother, and for many years it had been just the three of us, and she was the centre point of my family. And though I was familiar with death in many, many ways by that point, I'd lost Kurt, I'd lost other friends, I'd seen many people die. Here was death not in a war, but in a very banal and quite domestic way. Someone dying of cancer. Loads of people in this room are going to die of cancer. And it just crept up on us suddenly, little warning. Mum was diagnosed and was dead within 2 weeks. Bang. And it was a huge impact, and it did mark the end of my youth. The end of my youth.
The other thing that's happened is that you become a parent yourself. Has that affected the way you think about what you do for a living?
Yes, of course it has. Of course it has. There's a feeling of, I wouldn't say necessarily being expendable when you're not a parent working in war, but your responsibilities, you always think about death. You think, I could, it doesn't take a quantum leap of the imagination to realise that you could get killed on a job.
And sometimes you don't care that much, do you?
No, it's some days you don't care very much at all. It's not that you necessarily embrace it or welcome it, but you're quite prepared to play, to spin the wheel. And suddenly there is a feeling with parenthood, and I don't want to over-egg this too much, but it is there and it's very real, of a responsibility to someone beyond yourself. And my daughter's 7 months old, and I do tend to think now, when I'm on assignment and I'm making a call that do we drive down this road or not, it's not an absolute influence, but it's a very strong influence. I've seen it before, how easily a day that begins with blue skies, a little bit of distant gunfire in the background can suddenly turn into someone being dead. And, that is a backdrop to my decision process now. Who's going to be a father to my kid if I buy the farm today? It's not an absolute, put it this way, it's not a check on my decision process, but it's a very strong influence.
It's funny, when I was reading the book, I thought I'll write down the best turns of phrase, the most telling, the most evocative turns of phrase, but after a while, when there's 3 or 4 on every page, I don't want to flatter you overly, but I do recommend this book but there is one in particular where you talk about intuition and the problem with intuition, because it's so subjective and we all face it, and at the end of the day, it's all about feeling good about this decision, and it's not really based on objective criteria at all, is it?
No, intuition, if only intuition were 2020, but it's so difficult to try and second guess it, and you have to rely on it or more. It takes over from where your logic leaves off, and it can often save you. But the problem is, the more experience you get, so your intuition develops in war. And the more your intuition develops, the more it gets you through, the more it keeps you alive, the more you rely on it. But because it's not 2020, someday it can let you down when you believe in it.
But paradoxically, the more you come to rely upon it, the more unreliable it becomes. Don't you think?
The more you think about it, the less you can, the less you can trust it. Perhaps it's got to be instinctive. We're all on a downward spiral with chance. The more we do it.
And on that happy note, I've hogged his time long enough. Can I ask? There's a microphone or two wandering around the audience. Who would like to ask a question or put a point or share an experience or contribute in any way? Come on, there must be. Yes.
Please wait for the mics.
Thank you. I understand what Alan says about how your books evoke the feeling of war, the actuality of war, and may well be true. To be honest, I don't know. But what struck me about reading both your books was that there were 3 moments in them that were particularly and brutally evocative. Well, one's not a moment, a series of moments. One is when you're writing about your relationship with heroin. Another is when your friend dies, and another is when your mother dies. And those, ironically, are all incidents that are nothing to do with, or only tangentially to do with war, which seems to me to be quite ironic, and I wonder if you'd like to muse for a moment on what that says about your writing and about your work.
I'm not sure what it says about my writing and my work, but there's no doubt that I was very aware that regardless of whatever I'd seen in wars, particularly when it came to death itself, I'd seen, in my life, I suppose, including those in mass graves, thousands of bodies. I've seen quite a lot of people die. And I still think I remained quite ignorant of death itself until it started affecting me deeply, personally, by losing people I loved. Now, whether that was something that, in one way, is quite banal, like losing someone to cancer, or whether it's something slightly less banal but still quite explicable, it's losing someone because they get shot in the head. I'm very aware that those were probably certainly more affecting to me than anything I'd seen in war. And I think that it gave me a great, certainly what I was trying to write in this second book was not so much about war, but about an evolution of the understanding of death and love. And that came as much through what was happening in my domestic life, if you like, as in what I was seeing in war. So yes, I understand exactly what you're saying, and I'm the first to agree with it. I've found myself very profoundly affected by losses which will be very familiar to many people in this room. It doesn't have to be living in a city under siege.
But there is a charge, isn't there? Because you and I both know a lot of first-person journalists who use the misery of other people's conflicts as a way of promoting their own career. And we talked about that, the meretriciousness of what we do and how we Do you think you're open to the charge that in both of your books, the wars that you go to are nothing more than backdrops for your own personal development? That's a tough question for once.
Yes, I would say definitely. I'd say that charge sticks to some extent. I would say, I cannot sit here and say, have I never been self-indulgent in either book? Of course I've been self-indulgent. I'm 40 years old. I've written 2 memoirs. Now that's, of course that's self-indulgent to a point. I can't sit here and say not. But I would say as an undermining criticism, does that hold? Well, I would like to say, no, it doesn't matter. I would say that I always find it awkward to think, well, look, how much good have I actually done through my work as a journalist? And I think it's also important to say that these books were memoirs, and I distinguish them as different to my work as a journalist. Not totally different, but different. If I think, how much good have I done as a journalist? Well, I don't know. Maybe no good at all. Perhaps it's just added a little bit of understanding to some people's minds. Perhaps none at all. But I'd also say that my job as a journalist is to inform. I don't have to make a difference. If there's a reaction as a result of informing that is beneficial or positive, great. But that's not my job. All I've got to do is inform.
Yeah, there is there is a big difference in, I think, his 2 books and his journalism. I mean, you hardly ever write about yourself in the newspaper. You write about the people you meet, and you have this extraordinary knack, I think, of understanding people very quickly. Yeah, there's a man just here. Nope. Yep, that one.
I was just wondering if, in all the wars that you've covered, if you've ever been able to avoid taking sides, and if there is any benefit in avoiding taking sides, aside from what you actually write about, what you send out to the world, yourself as a person, have you found it a useful thing to try and avoid taking sides, or do you feel that in each of the instances there is a side that you have to take?
It's a very good question, and I think it's one of the sort of reef questions in which the profession of journalism so often founders, this question of objectivity. If we take a basic definition of objectivity as being to go into an environment without emotional prejudice or preconception, or to buy into the existing concepts of another individual or a group, and subjectivity to be the opposite of all of that, what should we be aspiring, what standpoint should we aspire to go into wars with? What I would say is that I'm not objective. I can't be purely objective. What is objective? As Kurt said, a rock is objective, and I'm not a rock. I'm full of blood and flesh and prejudice and electric impulses and past experiences and all the rest of it. I find it impossible, after a period of time, not to form an opinion and take a side. I try to go into wars using, I hope, common sense, but I also rely on my past, experience in life as one has to as a journalist in order to help one evaluate a situation. I don't have a problem with taking sides as a journalist. I try and go in and keep calm in a war situation, and I say that not necessarily on a day-to-day basis, but just war gives rise to huge emotion, both for the participants involved and for an observer getting involved. You've got to be aware of that. You can't override it, but be aware of that. I try and do the best I can, but to answer your question, I'm not objective. I try to be as objective as I can. Inevitably, as time goes by, I end up taking a side. I don't think there's a problem with that. I think a bigger problem arises when you try and strike neutrality between what may emerge to be a greater evil and a lesser good. If you're always trying to hamstring yourself by striking a position of neutrality, I think you're actually losing out, and I think you're actually not portraying things as it is.
There was a problem in Bosnia with the war that you and I did together, in that we were always under pressure, in the name of some spurious objectivity, to balance the preposterous and outrageous with the reasonable and the plausible. And that's not objectivity or balance at all. I mean, we came under that pressure, didn't we, over and over again, from our news desks, from our government, to balance the just with the unjust. And that was a kind of that was a kind of defining experience, wasn't it?
The accepted reasoning behind many of the editors, and certainly the government in Britain at the time during the Bosnian War, was they're all as bad as each other. We don't want to get involved. The reality on the ground, while I'm not painting the Bosnian government in a sort of light of halos, was there was clearly a greater evil and a lesser good. And between the forces represented actually by the Bosnian government, which were by and large leaning towards multi-ethnicity and coexistence, and the forces of rabid nationalism, editors back home did not really want to hear about the inequalities and injustices in Bosnia. The British government certainly didn't want to hear about it. If one had been a journalist trying to strike a position of neutrality in that the whole time, then you would have brought into the bullshit coming out of people at home, coming out from the powers that be at home.
Yeah, another question. Yes, who's got the microphone? Okay.
I just want to go back to what you mentioned about uneasiness of peace.
Can you point the microphone? I mean, none of this is an obvious thing to say, but can you just point it actually at your mouth and not so close to the top of it like this?
Okay. Yep. You mentioned that you felt uneasy as soon as you touched land, and having worked in places like Kosovo and Afghanistan, and having met a lot of UN and aid workers, we talk about the so-called mission junkies, in a way that when you're out in the field, you, even if you're a journalist or you work as an aid worker, you had to deal with other people's life. So you don't really think too much about yourself, and that your life, you had to come to terms to your life once you're back into either London or a small town in Italy, where everything is easy and quiet. And I wonder how that can be true for you, for example. So that, I mean, the quiet, when it's quiet and it's peace, you have to look into yourself while you're outside in the field. All you have to do is deal with other people's life.
That's very true. I think it's very common for anybody operating in a war. I've just come back from Afghanistan. I was there for a month. I came back to a situation where I've got to worry about mortgage, bills, moving house, X, Y, and Z. And I was very aware when I was in Afghanistan, hey, I don't have to worry about any of this for a month. And one does leave the trivia, which has to be dealt with, but the trivia of life behind you in a war. You're dealing with much more immediate things. There are two ways of dealing with it, which is one, to come back and still ignore it for as long as possible, which is when life becomes a problem and it all starts snarling up and you turn into, as you say, a mission junkie and just can't wait to go away the next time. Or the other option is to come back and face the music with the domestic grind, and you have to do that if you are not to become one of these quite sad people who only are alive when they are away. One further thing, it was quite interesting for me, I don't know what the answer is here, but I've just had this quite intense month doing an embedded assignment, which is quite unusual for me. I'm not often embedded, with the Royal Marines in southern Afghanistan. Now these are guys, normally the same group of people for quite a long time, who are in, if not almost daily fighting, then certainly, a couple of big fights a week. And seeing them and the way they handled their life there, this was, living for the next contact. They're a very tight group of guys. There was a sort of love within the units, and you have to be quite familiar with war, as I'm sure many people here are, to understand that. And these were guys who were definitely not worrying about the mortgage at home. They were, living for the next firefight with the Taliban. Now, I was only there for a month, but it took me about 3 nights to get to sleep after that assignment had finished when I was in Kabul, because it was so intense. And I've got no idea how, if you're a 22-year-old Royal Marine who's just had 6 months of that, how possibly you readapt your leaking, mouldy-walled marriage quarters in Plymouth with your wife, who does not want to listen to war stories. She wants, the housekeeping cash and to unload some worries on you. I don't know how those soldiers adapt at all. They have to.
You adapted through heroin. Because you went through the same thing 15 years ago, and part of the way you adapted to the banality of life back here was through heroin. But as you get older, do you find being on the road slightly less thrilling than it was 15 years ago? And do you find the banalities of domestic existence more pleasing than you did then?
I don't find the banalities of domestic existence more pleasing, but I find I can deal with them more easily. And I do still find it very thrilling being on the road. I find it easier coming back, though, because I have a delight in my life here. I have a very conscious awareness of my life here, and I've had to adapt my work life to that, and I did that some years ago. I used to be abroad 7, 8, 9 months, probably 9 months a year, each year for 7 to 8 years, before the cut-off point at which I said this is not sustainable anymore. If I am to have some sort of balance in my life, I can only do this 4 months. I can only do 4 months of war a year. So now I'm only away for 4 months. And I work hard to have my life here, but I also find it easier. I want to come home. When it's time to come home, I have a delight in coming home. That is not to say, though, that I don't still delight in the time I have away.
But that's a different balance to what you had 15 years ago, isn't it?
Completely different balance, yeah.
There's somebody over here. Yep.
Yes. Hello. You've been discussing your experiences and Alan's been questioning you in the light of, I suppose, your personal awareness of how you might have benefited from war and all the rest of it. And I suppose my question relates more to war itself. I mean, many people, from Clausewitz to, important Freud and Einstein and others, have discussed war and what it might mean and what its attractions are. And I wondered whether you might come at this in a slightly different analytical way than, how journalists might benefit from it. And whether it's something like, whether you enjoy seeing kind of clashing principles, whether you enjoy seeing people who are absolutely down on their uppers, whether it's something about you living your life at its maximum and actually then having the miracle of life in the midst of death, whether those are the sorts of things that are appealing about war, which can't be replaced by other things.
War is a part of us, and as long as two people are left alive on this world, there will be war, or there will certainly be dispute, possibly violent dispute. There is the side of it which I've talked about already, and we've talked about the camaraderie, the excitement, the disturbing sides, personal development, if you like it, and all the rest. I also find that war is part of the interest and fulfillment I have is seeing the challenge, not a personal challenge, sometimes a personal challenge, but the challenge to other people. And at this, I accept the suffering and death of other people that is incorporated into my answer here. But, for example, the huge challenge in seeing something like, to use the example of a recent assignment with these British Marines in southern Helmand. These are young men whose job is to move to that point, which is probably the very edge of civilization, at which moment they take the life of another man. And I say that's the edge of civilization because that's the point when you're saying to somebody, I'm going to take away your most sacrosanct right, which is your life, and I'm going to pump you full of lead, or I'm going to cover you in fire, and I'm going to take your life. But I'm going to take it in a way which is very codified, in order not to be seen as just a common killer. I will take your life, but I have to perform that act in a way which expresses a humanity, and perhaps by humanity I mean a compassion and a mercy. Not in taking necessarily your life, because I'm still going to pump you full of lead or coat you in fire, but making sure that that boundary and that parameter does not extend to the person in the house next door who is different to you in some way, perhaps because they haven't got a weapon or whatever, to not allow that moment to extend into something greater and more reckless and more abandoned. And seeing, which is one of the reasons why the concept of honour has been taught in so many military academies for thousands of years, because it marks an interface between whether you believe in total war, which is basically anything goes, no rules, and a codified approach to war, which is what many armies try and incorporate. And I'm just using that as one of the examples of something which I'm allowed to see in war as an observer, which never ceases to amaze me, and I find deeply interesting, either because the fact we expect our soldiers to adhere to higher codes of behaviour than in civilian life at a time of them killing people, or because it breaks down and it doesn't work out and they go and pull an Iraqi family out of a house, kill the men, rape the women, and kill them too. And that kind of issue, I don't know how it fits in personally with me, but as I try and see that professionally and understand that, I find that very, very interesting. I don't know whether that's to my detriment or not, but that is an example of huge moral challenge which I see being either surmounted by other people or other people failing to surmount it, and is one of, say, the fulfillments of my job, but issues like that make my job extremely interesting.
Hi, I just wondered, I've talked to you last year as a researcher, so you may recognise me, and I've already asked you plenty of questions. But something that occurred to me as a result of today's discussion is, I just wonder to what extent you feel as a print journalist, on the back of the question that you were asked about identification, taking sides, etc., how much you feel that your use of emotion is conscious, assuming that obviously you still, as a professional journalist, aim for objectivity, but to what extent do you feel that you are consciously using your emotion to identify in a certain way, or understanding yourself in such a way that informs the way you see the world? Is there anything conscious about the way you use emotion there? If that makes sense.
That makes sense. Most of the time I find it fairly unconscious. I don't... No, it's a good question. It's a good question. I try to be aware of how emotionally I am reacting to a situation, in order, if necessary, to cantilever it. I found, for example, the assignment I've just come back from extremely complicated, because on the one hand I was very lucky. I had fantastic access with these Royal Marines for a month. I mean, I could not have been given better access. It was platinum card access to do whatever, accompany the lead assault section clearing out Taliban 50 yards away. Okay, you're with them. Deliberate attack, 2 companies, air cover, in you go. Whatever. We had it. On another level, I found it extremely difficult to be with, particularly in the last 10 days of the month, with the same group of 7 Royal Marines. These are guys who essentially are from my tribe. They speak my language. They're of my nationality. They were quite, well-educated, bunch of guys. Many of them were far better educated than me. They had degrees, this, that, and the other. They were very funny. Their approach to war was quite even-handed. When it was time to shoot people, they shot people. When it was time to sort of grip and grin, they could do that too. Over the course of 10 days, these are people whose intimacy, you eat together, you sleep together, you shit together, you get shot at together. And you have to be sociopathic not to start identifying with these guys and stop seeing me and them and start to see we. And I was very aware of that, and that was complicated. Fortunately, it was never really challenged, and if I had seen them do something bad, I would have, certainly written about it. But some of the confidences, or for example, some of the times they confided in me, because it wasn't just me beginning to lose my sense of an outside status, it was also them. And so they would confide things in me, which I would think afterwards, well, look, hang on, were they telling me that because I was a journalist and they wanted it reported? Or, more likely, were they just telling me that because I had been an outsider, but I was now part of the group, and they felt they could tell me stuff, and some quite searing stuff to do with civilian casualties and all the rest of it, which then left me with the question that, well, I've got to strike a very careful and fair balance here as to how I report some of the civilian deaths that these men have caused in the context of the privacy of their confidence, or the fact that maybe they wanted it out. And these are pretty, I had guys telling me about, very, very difficult instances of the death of innocence. So to answer your question, that was an emotional engagement that I was aware of and I was conscious of, and it made things very difficult.
Hi, Anthony.
Sure.
I remember reading your first book. I haven't read your new book, and I was away on a story, and returning to London to get married, and I was so moved by it, I almost didn't come home to get married, because it would have meant not being on the road, and I wish I hadn't got married because I got divorced. But what struck me about that book and the best war reporting, I think people sometimes miss this point. What's palpably obvious in that book is not only beneath the intensity of the visceral nature of the reporting, I think reporting is the wrong word, but writing about war. That it was obviously, you came across as a person, the writing of, that you were drawn in by the story, that you lived that story, it was the people, the human element, the political nature, it was a story that fascinated you, and on top of that, there's this incredibly intense war situation, which you've been focusing on more in today's talk. Do you ever worry that what happens is journalists who, that's the best war reporting, and then those journalists who are caught up in those wars then tend to go to perhaps are drawn to another war as opposed to another story, because it's the most obvious, it's the most intense aspect. But unless you're as drawn to the story and as connected, that somehow it becomes a bit of an empty shell, and that I have that fear that I can't now think of a story unless someone's getting shot at. But that's not how I got into doing what I was doing. Does that concern you? And do you think that without being interested in the story, that the reporting won't be the same or as good?
Yes, definitely. And I think it's very difficult as well. Your first war might not be your most intense war, but it possibly, even probably will be. And for me, Bosnia was the definitive experience of my life in terms of war, and I don't expect that to be recreated in any way, but perhaps a part of me still desires to seek that recreation, a recreation. And I've been very aware that wars such as Iraq, which is, a huge, defining, important war, of our moment is a story which, for many reasons, I find it very difficult to engage with. And so I find myself out there from time to time, not admittedly for the last year, but from time to time, partially to sort of, as a professional touchstone, like you've got to keep going back here, be fair to it, but still without any sort of traction at all, and often I feel like I'm wasting my time out there. It is a place which, I do not love. I feel very little engagement with it. I feel very little engagement with what goes on there, and I should feel a huge engagement, but I don't. Whereas Afghanistan is a place I probably know better than Bosnia. I don't know it hugely well, but I've just put a lot of time in there over the last 12 years. And I do feel a real emotional investment in. And I'm very aware that there was a period in my life of perhaps 4 years when I was what's called a fireman, being sent around by the Times, reacting very quickly to stories and being sent. And though I was more experienced as a journalist as time went by, I actually had less to offer. It's very difficult getting off a plane in some country you've never been to before, where there's a war going on, and you're suddenly like, well, I'm going to be here for 2 or 3 weeks. I haven't even got time to get to know anybody, really. It's very difficult.
But that didn't stop you in Bosnia, did it? Because that's exactly what you did in Bosnia, and within a few weeks you were contributing really great stuff. And I remember Kurt, your friend Kurt, showed me his first notebook from when he arrived in Sarajevo in the same way. And he said, look at this, page 1. The president's name is Izetbegovic. That's what he'd written. That's how little he knew. But that didn't stop him really getting under the skin of it. It didn't stop you really getting under the skin of it. Why now, with more experience, does it impede you, do you think?
I don't feel as impeded in Afghanistan as I do in other places, but I just find there has to be, I don't know what it is, it's some sort of issue with the country itself, or there is some sort of issue within the war itself which resonates. Now, in Bosnia, okay, it was my first proper war, but Bosnia was a big deal. Here we were, Europe, 200,000 people dead in 4 years. A huge question of a challenge to morality. What kind of Europe do we live in? Which I would argue we're actually feeling the ramifications of our failure there now. That was disgusting. And we didn't intervene to stop it until it was too late, and we sort of intervened in a sort of very belated fashion. Afghanistan has a big emotional resonance with me because, apart from being a country which I find very charming and a people I find intoxicating, it is a country which has absolutely had its face ground into the dirt for 30 years, and I really hope something better will happen to it now. That's not to say, so I feel very engaged with that country. Now, that's not to say that Iraq doesn't deserve better than it's got now. It most certainly does. But there is some other factor which I can't define in Iraq. Maybe it's some very subliminal factor. Maybe it's something that's staring me in the face, but I just can't recognize it. It just doesn't, I don't know.
It's quite ridiculous because Iraq was my first war. 1991 was the first time I did war, and so I engage with it emotionally the way you do with Afghanistan, but I can't go there anymore. I can't. I'd made a decision not to, and I went all through the 90s, and I last went in 2003, and I've stopped now, and I miss it, and I feel very guilty actually that I haven't been going, and it's a wrench. But it's not the same as Bosnia, because in Bosnia those front lines were open to us. We could go anywhere we liked. It was dangerous and risky, but nobody was trying to murder us. In Iraq, people are trying to murder us. They want not what closes down access to the war is not that you might get killed in crossfire, which was true in Bosnia, but that somebody was trying to kill you, and that has made reporting the Iraq war in effect impossible, hasn't it? Almost impossible.
Almost impossible. I'm actually amazed how well informed British society is over the core issues in Iraq, considering that journalists basically can't engage with Iraqi people at all.
You can't jump in your car and go to Ramadi and sit in somebody's house
you
for an afternoon.
You can't get in your car and go and vox pop people in the central street in a middle-class area in Baghdad, let alone go to Ramadi. And yet...
But you could 4 years ago. You could go... I went to Ramadi 4 years ago.
Yeah, you could just about 3 years ago. You can't now.
There's a question... Yeah.
Thank you. I wondered if you could just reflect on the whole question of being... kidnap, of being a war correspondent, in view of the Italian journalist who's just been freed, presumably for an enormous ransom, whether you've prepared yourself for that, whether you would want a ransom to be paid, given that it would then make life more dangerous for all your peers, etc.
In fairness, I think, as I understand, the Italian saw his driver getting his head cut off. I'm sure if I saw my driver getting his head cut off, I'd want quite a big ransom to be paid as soon as possible. It's a very difficult call to make. I mean, of course, we'd like to believe that, ransom shouldn't be paid because it encourages other people. I mean, certainly the British, although they espouse to never paying ransoms, they do negotiate with hostages. I know Ken Bigley ended up with his head cut off, but there was a very clear communication between Suqawi and his group holding Ken Bigley and the people who counted in the British embassy in Baghdad. There was a clear and ongoing negotiation. Both sides knew exactly who they should be speaking to and exactly what their demands were. We say we don't, but we do negotiate with kidnappers. Now, it might not be quite as bland and blatant as paying them millions of dollars or releasing prisoners, but we negotiate with kidnappers. It's a very difficult position as a journalist to know how to put it this way. If you take a risk, and you should often take a risk as a journalist, and it blows up, literally, you drive over a mine, you get killed, or you get taken hostage, there's no shortage of people in the queue who, if you had pulled it off, would have been saying, hey, brave man, good story, who are then saying, bloody idiot, he should have known. Now, I can't second guess the Italian. He made his choices. I don't know the kind of individual he was. I saw his photograph. He looked like quite a sort of wise elder man. I don't know. He made his calls. He got taken hostage. The driver got his head cut off. Someone paid a ransom. He got released. I certainly can't judge him, because we all make calls, and if, as I say, if it blows up, there's all sorts of people who judge you one way who would have judged you another if you pulled it off. By and large, I like to think ransoms aren't paid because it encourages other people to do the same, but I'm damn sure if it was me in his position, I'd want a ransom paid.
Yes. About 5, 10, 15 years from now, when your third book comes out, whatever it is, what are you hoping is actually going to be in it, and where to for you from here, as a journalist, as a father, as whatever else?
There definitely will not be another memoir.
Should we write that down?
Yes. Do. No, you're free to. That's it. No more memoirs. This was very difficult to write, and I'm not going to do another memoir. I think, as regards reporting in wars, that if a journalist can keep going into their sort of third decade of it. Now, I've only been a journalist for 14 years, but add the 5 years onto the army before that, so I'm approaching, the 20-year mark of my experience with armies or with wars. If you can keep going into your third decade, then you have a lot of advantages in your skills. You have a huge amount of experience to draw on. You have a lot of maturity in the way you see things. That said, it becomes an increasingly cumbersome job. Your fears don't get less, they become more. Your fears become actually the sort of inherited group memory of every bad day you've ever had. You don't get less frightened, you get a lot more frightened. You're aware how easy it is to die. You're aware that you're getting older. Your proximity with a shut-off point is getting narrower anyway. You can't run as fast. Your knees hurt. You smoke too much. And it's a very unwieldy job, to suddenly... For example, this time, as I say, this last assignment I had great access. There were a number of things. First of all, we got pitched pretty much into it. One evening, I was having supper with my family in London. 4 nights later, it's 4:30 a.m. in northern Helmand. I'm with 160 Marines who are formed up in a silent form-up point just about to cross the start line for H-hour into a major attack on the Taliban. And I'm thinking, Jesus, man, you better get your brain, into northern Helmand from London in about 10 minutes, because people are about to start dying here, and you better make sure you're not one of them. And it becomes, as you get older, you're very much more conscious that you're slower. And I remember also seeing, just as we moved to that form-up point, an old Marine, their technical quartermaster sergeant, this guy had a bit of grey, walking along the line, and these are guys just about to go in and kill people and possibly lose some themselves. They didn't, as it happened. And he walked down the line, he said, "All right, lads, are you happy to see this old bastard out on the op with you?" And they were all laughing at him because he was much older than them. And I was laughing too. And then I realised, no, he's like a couple of years younger than me. Your skin gets thinner and it gets more difficult to deal with. But if you can keep it going, you have the different colours that you see with age. I don't know.
Take 2 more. One, who's got the microphone here? And then one down here. And that's it. Sorry.
I'd like to pick up on that last point, if I may. I read your stuff in the Times from your embedding with the Marines, and I thought about something then, and you reminded me of it again tonight. I'm assuming, and please tell me if I'm wrong, that the field craft you learnt from 5 years as a soldier puts you way ahead of most of your competition as a war correspondent. In other words, how many others out there could do what you did in that particular contact type of situation whereby you could do it, you could survive?
It did help. And often people say, look, it must help hugely being a soldier. And often it's not. You get into a firefight, it's very confusing, doesn't matter how much experience you've had, a firefight's confusing. In Afghanistan last month it did help because it was rough living. It was really, really cold. Just the day-to-day simple things of being out on a patrol. One of the long patrols, 10 days. There's no electricity. By dusk, you've got to be absolutely quiet. There's no light. You get shot at a lot. Something as simple as, you want to take a crap. Well, you can't go wandering off to find some private place in the distance because someone will shoot you. So you dig in the shovel, and you're in with the Marines when they all start throwing rocks at you and you're having a crap. You've got to be able to throw them back and chat at the same time. So it's like, and when you wake up in the morning, you're sleeping under a poncho, it's freezing, so you roll it up, and by the time you roll it up to the side of the vehicle, your fingers are completely numb with ice. At dawn every morning, you've got to, you get up at 5 something, you've got to have all your kit rolled away, strapped to the side of the vehicle, everyone ready to go, everyone ready for an attack. That sort of stuff. If some civilians, I suppose, would have adapted to it quite quickly, but it would have been a real shock. It was quite a shock for me. So it did help then. Oh yeah, and I said to them straight up, because they kept on saying, "Hey, look, come up right to the front," like, with the sort of lead gunner, and I was like, "Yeah, okay, but I don't want to get in your way." And that wasn't said in a way of, I didn't feel very frightened with them. It was a refreshing change to be with a large group of professional guys who knew what they were doing. I knew the plan, the orders, and I knew that if something went wrong, someone would patch me up and get me on a helicopter out within 45 minutes, the platinum 45 minutes you've got to save someone's life. God, it was a really refreshing change. It was sort of a breeze. But also, I wasn't all over them. I wasn't like, yeah, blow the wall and send me through it first. I was like, do your job, and, I'll stand behind the fat one,
Say one more.
Can you explain if and why the reporting of a story should ever be worth the taking of a journalist's life?
No, it's a very, very difficult one. But I'd also say that if you're the family of a soldier or a fighter, in most societies, taking it to this society, British society, how can you ever accept the loss of your son, your brother, your husband, your boyfriend, whatever, killed as being worth it in a war? And it's something which no family of a journalist, I don't think, can accept as, we just lost our man or we just lost our woman killed in this war. it was all worth it. You know, the rawness of that grief for those people will always override any sort of transcendental, sort of altruistic feelings they've got towards the situation or whatever. No, you can't. It's impossible. Journalists, therefore, have to be quite selfish and driven people. They have to sort of shut off from that reality. And as well, that they do shut off, because otherwise no one would go to war.
I'm going to draw it to a close there. Let me remind you, tomorrow night and Sunday afternoon, 2 fascinating events here. Please come. If you want, wait a minute, if you want to join the Frontline Club, if you want to think about it, come and speak to somebody downstairs, 1 floor below. Anthony is going to be stuck here for the next 3 hours signing books. If you would like to come and get a copy of his book and have him sign it, you can do so now. If not, you can join us downstairs for a drink. It's been a fantastically fascinating hour and a half. Please thank Anthony Loyd.